Welcome to all of you who are joining us now for the African Forum on Green Economy, Investing in Natural Capital for a Resilient Africa. We'll give it the obligatory minute or two just to let everyone to sign in before we get started. So we're just going to give it a little bit more time to make sure we've got everyone online who wants to join us today. Okay, so let's get started now. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us here today. A very exciting session we've got here on finance. Now, a lot of you will be aware that we were planning to have a face-to-face event in Kampala this month, or actually it was a couple of months ago now, in April. And obviously, due to global circumstances, we've moved this onto an online event. This is the fourth in a series of 6 webinars that we're running, all supported by these organizations that you'll see here on the screen, including the Capitals Coalition. My name is Mark Goff. I'm the CEO of the Capitals Coalition, but many other partners as well, including WWF, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, Green Economy Coalition, and many others, as you can see here. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback here. If we can just mute whoever that is. Excellent. So I just thought I'd start by giving you a little bit more context to what we're talking about here today. There's lots of terms and technologies and different ways of thinking about things that we all use, and we're all aiming towards the same purpose in the end of a better planet, a more sustainable, fairer, and just planet. But we use different terms to get there and different approaches. And one of these is the green economy, which I'm hoping you'll all be very familiar with. The green economy supports prosperity for everyone within the ecological limits of the planet. It allows the natural systems, the biodiversity, water, soils, forests, and people to thrive together. And it redistributes natural, physical, financial wealth, closing the gap between the rich and the poor. And that's even more important today than it ever was. It brings diverse voices into the policy-making process and delivers fair outcomes for all. And the Green Economy Coalition brings all of those organizations that are working on this space together through these 5 different focus areas: measuring and governing, reforming the financial systems, which is what we're going to be covering today, the greening of economic sectors, tackling inequality, and valuing nature. And if we go on to another term that we use a lot, if we can do, which is going to be natural capital. So natural capital is a way of thinking about the stock of resources that deliver a flow of benefits to people. Now, some people don't like being referred to as capital or the term capital, but it's been a great opener of doors for us in the way that we engage with businesses and policymakers and financial institutions particularly, because what it does is it starts putting our relationship to nature and to people into a context that we can understand, a way that if we invest in nature, we get returns which are going to help us to drive economic change, to drive reductions in inequality, to address climate change. It's an underpinning to a lot of the other things that we see going on in the world, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, whether we're thinking about the circular economy, all of these sort of things. You'll need to be having a good understanding of your relationship with nature, first of all, and to do that, you need a capitals approach. We have, as I said today, a very exciting webinar. This is built around other webinars that we're running. And the purpose of this African Forum on Green Economy is to promote the understanding of the value of the value of nature to Africa's economy and what different stakeholders can do to realize this as a sustainable opportunity. It's also about connecting stakeholders. And we've been very fortunate to have a wonderful set of speakers on this webinar series. And we've got 3, 4 more to you today here, which I'm sure are going to give us a great rundown on their thoughts around finance and how natural capital and finance can come together in Africa. It's also, though, it has to be going beyond just having a presentation to building collaborative actions. And what we want at the end of this process is to make sure that there's activities going on the ground to allow people to actually take this into practice. And that's extremely important. I'm now going to pass over to Vanessa, who's going to run us through the webinar today and introduce our guests and run you through a little bit more of the process of how we're going to run this. So over to you, Vanessa.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for that overview and introduction. And welcome to all those who have connected to the webinar from Africa and across the world. My name is Vanessa O'Shea. I'm the manager of the Policy Analysis Division in the African Natural Resources Center of the African Development Bank, and I'll be moderating the session today. We have a distinguished lineup of experts who are going to speak to the issue of how we can integrate natural capital in development finance. And I think this is a very important question, given the challenges that Africa is currently facing in finding sustainable pathways and solutions out of the crisis that has been caused by COVID-19. So this is a very timely and pertinent conversation, and we look forward to hearing from all our speakers. So as you can see, we have a very compact agenda, a brief welcome and introduction of the speakers, and then we'll give them time to offer their perspectives. And following that, there'll be an open discussion of question and answers with the audience. We can proceed. So if you want to ask a question, you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. And I will collect the questions and ask all the speakers after they've made their introductions. So, but please be on mute so that you don't interfere with the conversation. Next. So this is our lineup of speakers today. First of all, Professor Kevin Urama, who is Senior Director of the African Development Institute in the African Development Bank. Alice Ruveza, who is the Africa Regional Director of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, and Thomas O'Brien, who is Senior Advisor to the Vice President for the Africa region at the World Bank. So let me quickly run through their biographies to give you a sense of their experiences and how they can really shape the conversation today. So the African Development Institute, which is headed by Professor Orama, is a focal point for capacity development in the African Development Bank. And it supports efforts to build sustainable capacity for development effectiveness in the AFDB's regional member countries. Professor Orama was formerly the Senior Policy Advisor to the AFDB President on Inclusive and Green Growth, and he's based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. So welcome, Kevin, to the panel. Our second speaker, Ms. Alice Ruveza, joined WWF as the Regional Director for Africa in July 2019, and she leads WWF's work in Africa to position it as a key actor in the sustainability agenda. Before she joined WWF, Alice worked for Conservation International, first as Executive Director of the Vital Signs Program, and later as Interim Vice President of Sustainable Production. And Alice is based in Nairobi, Kenya. Alice, it's a pleasure to have you on the panel. Welcome. And finally, our third speaker is Thomas O'Brien. Thomas is Senior Advisor on Sustainable Development to the World Bank's Vice President for Africa. In this role, he helps shape the bank's strategy for Africa, and he oversees a portfolio of around $75 billion in more than 600 projects across all sectors. He's worked on country programs in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and Eritrea, seeking to reduce poverty and promote shared prosperity. He's also provided policy advice to ministers of finance and other policymakers. And Thomas is joining us from Washington, DC. So welcome, Thomas. So to get started, I think we can turn quickly to Kevin, who is going to provide the first intervention and run us through some of his key insights on how NDBs can integrate natural capital in development finance. So Kevin, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you to all the delegates that have joined us this afternoon, depending on where you are joining from. For me, this particular topic is very important at this stage and very close to my heart for several reasons. It derives more from the questions that has been asked. First, in terms of we need to understand what actually is natural capital and what roles can it play or should it play for Africa's development. where should MDBs intervene in that process? And specifically for COVID-19, what specific roles should natural capital play in the recovery path that countries are trying to chart from this pandemic of COVID-19? And then specifically then, how can we actually finance natural capital? I will try to focus my intervention, my 5-minute intervention, on trying to address those questions. First, in my view, natural capital, as defined already for us, I'm not going to dwell on it, is very much all-inclusive. And for most African economies, our economies are actually natural capital based. Most of the economies of Africa is dependent on exporting raw materials, largely unprocessed goods from commodities based on the natural capital assets that we do have. But the challenge in Africa has been that we have not really thought of natural capital as an asset base. And therefore, people always think of it as something you just need to extract and sell and make the financial capital money for development. And until you have extracted it and sold it and made the money, it doesn't count to your GDP growth as we know it as at the moment. So I will be thinking more, a little bit more in the discussion about how we can actually integrate natural capital to development project financing, and also integrate natural capital to national accounting systems, so that it becomes mainstream instead of something like the pool that we have to just continue extracting from without thinking of adding value to what we have extracted, and also returning value to sustain that base, the natural capital, which is the base for the economy that we have. From that perspective, it's already clear to me that natural capital, in my perspective, is more of the main buffer for African fiscal and monetary policy. We have seen in COVID-19 all the huge stimulus that has been released by different countries, but Africa is constrained because we don't have enough of the financial capital. So how are we going to be able to then integrate natural capital into that thinking, so that at least it can become something like a guarantee for access to other forms of capital that we need for development? So these are questions that I'd like to ask as we go forward in this seminar. Then the other point is the opportunities for MDBs. Development finance institutions, I see, based on how I have defined natural capital, has huge opportunities to actually invest in natural capital in order to achieve the development objectives that we all have in MDBs, which is to increase development effectiveness. One is through what has been described as nature-based solutions. And in my view, all solutions we have on Earth is actually nature-based. So how do we ensure that when we are investing in an infrastructure project, that we're actually not destroying the nature, which is actually the source of the infrastructure project? Whether you are building a road or building a house or building a port, you take from natural capital in order to build that. But in the current feasibility studies, we think about other returns, and we're not really thinking very carefully about the value of that natural capital that we're either destroying or enhancing by creating that infrastructure that we're investing in. So I would like us to think a little bit more about the nature-based solutions, so that we actually think about investment as circulating natural capital from one form to the other, without actually destroying it. So that will lead to the sustainability we've talked about. Then the other point I want to highlight is beneficiation. This comes to mind a lot when in the extractive sector. So we need to ensure that when we are extracting natural capital, we're not, as Africans, we're not just extracting it to sell it raw, but we actually add value to it so that it can earn more of the financial capital that we normally go for in terms of GDP growth and so on, and then be able to feed back in terms of investing in maintaining that asset base, which is the natural capital that we have. So I've talked about this, then that will also lead us to the next stage of investments, which is the value chain development. we need to think about gold, from the raw gold to the gold and the main street shops that is selling. Diamond in the same way, water in the same way, land in the same way, soils in the same way, rare earth minerals in that same way. So when we are investing in natural capital, it's not just to invest to extract them, but actually think about the value chain, the distance or the journey it will make from the extraction to the end to the use of that. So these are areas that I think we need to think through as MDBs and development finance agencies on how we invest in natural capital. For COVID-19 specifically, then for me, it is more about thinking about the inclusive value of nature and how we are going to, whether it's the monetary policy, the fiscal policy, the exchange rate policy, or the health policy, how do we actually ensure that natural capital is at the center of it? Because in the end, health is pharmaceuticals and therapeutics and vaccines is only trying to extract from nature in order to solve a particular problem. So we need to think about that in that way and how we try to invest in it. So specifically, because I have only 5 minutes, we need to think through 5 key areas. How do we mainstream natural capital in our investments, our development planning, and our development policies? 2, how do we as MDBs and development finance agencies engage with the countries in terms of policy dialogue to enable them to understand the value of that natural capital that they have? All African countries are very rich in natural capital, but it's not seen as an asset. How do we start changing that mindset so that we can actually see natural capital as an asset base, or at least a partial guarantee for the other investments that we're trying to do? 3 is how to feature natural capital into risk ratings of countries. I'm going to just run through because I see my time is already gone. And then 4, training on mainstreaming natural capital in development processes, training on natural capital accounting at the country level, training on MDBs and development finance agencies in structuring projects that takes into account the value of natural capital. And in doing this, the African Development Institute is working with partners to establish a natural capital academy, which will be launching very soon. And Vanessa is working with us on this, and the GGKP and so on. Then finally, integrating natural capital into national policy frameworks so that we will be able to plan in a more inclusive way, and that will lead to a more sustainable development. And in that, with that, I'm going to stop because I've overused my time, and I'm willing to come back to answer questions later. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for those very insightful comments. You've covered a broad range of issues on how we need to have a broad concept of natural capital, as well as a business case for MDBs to invest in natural capital and the opportunities for Africa to recover sustainably after COVID-19. So thank you for those remarks. And I'll now turn to Alice. Alice, you have the floor to share your perspectives with us, given your experiences in WWF. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you very much, Capitals Coalition, for inviting me to speak at this event. So I'll focus my remarks on how we can position Africa's natural capital as a launchpad for post-COVID-19 recovery. Kevin has obviously covered a lot of natural capital here. I will talk about wildlife. When you look at wildlife as you look at nature-based tourism, it generated 194.2 billion in direct revenue from tourists visiting protected areas and other opportunities and tour operators. We have our forests, which are carbon stocks, big carbon sinks, and for climate change mitigation. We have our blue economy, our coral reefs, valued about 7.3 billion a year. We have our water towers, which are a source of water for agriculture and wildlife. We have renewable energy, big options there for solar PV, 10 to 15% of total electricity generated, and more and more. So when I look at the COVID-19 impacts in Africa, there are a lot, but you can look at health impacts, you can look at food insecurity, you can look at loss of tourism, which has really been a big challenge now. it comes to loss of jobs and incomes, increased debt. We are taking on more debt now. Even though there is debt forgiveness, we still have to repay that debt at some point. And we're seeing some increased dependence on natural resources in times of crisis, urban-rural migration. A lot of people have moved back home. And so there will be expansion of agriculture into encroachment into high conservation value areas and all of that. So how do we position the nature to this? We clearly see a need to continue to invest in tourism, even though at the moment, we are not getting those visitors from abroad. We do need to keep our wildlife in the parks, and we do need to keep our product that we keep selling. We need to keep it going. So investing in tourism is important. And it's also important in terms of its multiplier effects for other sectors. And so it's something that we want to see that. In terms of food, we see an opportunity now for nature to play a strong role in healthy diets. We have our traditional foods, as you know, part of our culture that we can take advantage of. They're from nature. We have our orphan crops, millet and teff and yam and cassava, high in magnesium and fiber. They provide income for most of our farmers, and they also serve as staples in local diets, and they're already locally adapted to our climate. Nature-based solutions, Kevin talked about this. I will add green jobs through restoration. You have your AFR 100, your Africa Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, you have your Great Green Wall. All those are things we can really put some effort on in terms of providing jobs. Renewable energy I mentioned, carbon stocks I mentioned, debt for nature swaps. We have our nature, our natural capital. Seychelles, we know it has its blue bond, where it managed to leverage its natural capital in return for a bond. We have our resilient infrastructure, which we can talk about, whether it's about restoration of natural areas that reduce resilience to floods and drought and hurricanes, all of that. A recent study shows there's a net benefit of 4.2 trillion from investing in this. Huge. And reduction of future pandemics through adopting a One Health approach that you may have heard about, making sure we are linking human health, natural capital, and environmental health. So for MDBs, obviously, Karen has already covered that. So what I will add here is obviously that MDBs are very good at serving as intermediaries between countries that need to invest in projects and private finance. The Kenya government, for example, benefited from the African Development Bank, WWF, and others in developing its green economy strategy and implementation plan. And this later resulted into a green bonds program in Kenya, a partnership that allowed WWF to develop the first green bond policy in Kenya, leading to an issuance of about 4.3 billion Kenya shillings to develop the largest sustainable student hostels in Kenya. So we know that the MDBs play a big role here. And we further call on them, obviously, to introduce environmental risk assessment and conditions into the packages that they give. I think Kevin already covered that. They are doing that. But also to de-risk private sector investment, because we know there's a lot of interest in private sector investment in Africa. But the question you always hear is that where are those bankable solutions? And I think I see the role of MDB helping that and doing that blended finance and helping the governments to do that, including those debt for nature swaps and debt for resilience. But for me, as someone who works in the conservation sector, I also see a lot of conservation finance as playing a role in here. You know about the GEF, about the RED Plus, the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Finance, of course, lots of impact investors interested in generating measurable social and environmental impacts as well. Great opportunities there. Conservation trust funds, opportunities there, trust funds for various things, whether it's water funds, whether it's wildlife, green bonds, I've mentioned those, conservancies. Here we have a lot of conservancies and community livelihoods there. But the one point I want to finish with that we are not talking about today, and I think is extremely important, is the investment in human capital. So it is not just natural capital, but we must invest in human capital. We need healthy and productive human populations for us to go forward. We need local knowledge and expertise, local innovation. We are the youngest continent. We have a youth population of 226 million youth living in Africa. We have to close that digital gender gap. We know that we need that access. We have our artificial intelligence and machine learning. We have education. Education is a big one, girl education, and the value that brings to an economy. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much, Alice, for those insights. Very instructive, and I totally agree with you. You defined a broad range of nature-based solutions that we already have at our fingertips. And as you said, the key thing is to incentivize them and de-risk investments. So thank you for those insights. I'll now turn to Thomas to give us his intervention, perhaps following on from the issues that Alice has highlighted on how we can bring in the private sector in a very constructive way into the natural capital space. So Thomas, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning from Washington. Good morning and good afternoon to my colleagues in Africa and Europe. And thanks very much, Vanessa and Kevin, and also Alice, great remarks. And by the way, on human capital, I couldn't agree more with you. When I'm not working on climate change, that's the other big topic that I spend all my time on. So if folks are interested, if I can beg your indulgence, not to take time now, but I'll send you a very interesting piece that we've been doing on this topic, Alice, because I 100% agree with you. So if I can just move the slide forward a little bit, I just want to give the colleagues on the conference call a flavor of what we've been doing, so you can get a sense of how this looks from an institution like the World Bank's perspective. And I'm going to emphasize the natural capital part, but I just want to set it in the context of our overall work on Africa and climate change. And it's a fascinating topic because Africa is the continent which has done the very, very least around the world to contribute to climate change, and yet it's the one which is hit hardest. And frankly, that's unfair, and but it's something that we've got to deal with. So we actually put together our own World Bank climate business plan 3 or 4 years ago, just at the time of the Paris conference. And since then, we've made, I think, good progress on the plan, but we need to make even better progress given the scale of the issue. We've invested $30 billion in climate-related activity over the last few years, which makes us one of the largest climate financiers on the continent. More than 300 projects, and this effort to get climate impact, or what we call climate co-benefit, is not just in obvious projects around forestry and environment and water. It's in everything we do. It's in agriculture, it's in energy, it's in transport, it's even in health and education. And we have got about 28% of our projects are now delivering climate co-benefits, which is much higher than our targets. So that's something we want to carry on pushing. Now, the next slide will show you that even though we've done that, we know that we have to move the agenda forward even more. We need to ramp up climate adaptation and resilience. And we know that. A very quick example was in Beira in Mozambique. Many of you remember that was hit hard by that terrible cyclone. Actually, ironically, large parts of Beira were protected because we and other partners had been investing in drainage and coverage. So that was good. But of course, the bad thing is these crises are now so challenging and so enormous that even that investment is not enough. That's why we need to do, that's a little small example why we need to do more. So we're going to ramp up our climate adaptation and resilience and link it to a manifold increase in energy access. And the next element of the slide, if you can just move ahead for me, we also need to do that by promoting development, green development in a new way. And I think Kevin and Alice talked about new technologies, and there are so many of those coming forward, and they're so much more affordable now. In the energy sector particularly is the most obvious example, where solar power used to be almost unaffordable. Now we've helped get solar power in places like Senegal for less than 4 cents a kilowatt hour. The global average is about 10 or 12. So that shows you the progress that can be made. Now the next slide, just move it one more forward, please. So the next slide is, we've had this business plan, but as I said, we want to do more. We need to do more. We need to do more with our partners. So we're just developing what we're terming our next generation Africa Climate Business Plan, and we're making that available to folks shortly for comment and input. And it has 5 key directions, but what I want to say is that little phrase at the top there, development centered, is quite important. I think we're all hopefully on the same side here, but I just want to explain, we approach issues, yes, from a climate angle, but also equally, if not equally importantly, from a development angle, what's going to help people get better livelihoods? What's going to make economies grow in a sustainable level, a sustainable way? I think that's important in its own right, but for one other reason, that's the way a lot of policymakers, a lot of ministers, that's the way they view it. So we need to be aligned with them so that we can get a coalition for action. So we have 5 main themes. And the first one is the one I'm going to spend a couple of moments about later on, cherishing the natural environment. That's kind of my wording of the natural capital agenda that Mark mentioned in the beginning. Growing green energy, I spoke about. Food security, absolutely critical. Building resilient, clean cities, because more and more Africa's population is becoming urbanized. In Kenya, I think our speaker was from, it will be 50% of the population in urban locations by 2030. And last but not least, protecting against climate shocks, because no matter what we do, those shocks will be there. The next slide shows that we're also going to connect 2 elements there on climate macro policy and resilient infrastructure. But I did promise to spend a couple of moments towards the end giving you a flavor of, well, what's the type of contribution that we have been making and can make on cherishing the natural environment. And I want to give you just a handful of examples. The first on the left there is something called the WACA project, West Africa Coastal Areas Initiative. 6 countries, more than 2,000 kilometers of coastal line, and that's being eroded more than 2 meters a year. I was out in Benin just a few months ago, and you can see that the coast is collapsing and houses and people and communities are being affected. That's just one example, but it's 2,000, 20 million people's homes and livelihoods are at risk. So we're helping our countries invest in ways of reducing coastal erosion and flooding, protecting people's property and livelihood, and changing their way of doing things so this coastal erosion becomes less intense. Zambia is the opposite end of the spectrum. That's an inland country, and we're working on particular ways in which we can get climate smart agriculture, opening up old canals and things like solar powered boreholes, because you're having to dig deeper now to get the water, and you don't want that to be powered by diesel in the pumping system. You want a solar system. That's an example of what we're doing in Zambia. The next slide shows you 2 other ones and 2 huge countries. Ethiopia, one of the fastest growing and largest countries in Africa. We've got more than 900,000 hectares of land now being sustainably managed by local communities and farmers. And similarly in Nigeria, we are reducing vulnerability to soil erosion, helping watershed management on a very, very large scale. So they're just 4 examples of what we're doing. And I just conclude on the next slide by obviously thanking you for your attention, but just saying something more. We're going to continue this campaign. You can count on us as a strong multilateral supporter. We're going to be putting substantial amounts of our effort, expertise, and resources behind this. The need for action is bigger than ever, and we're looking to both develop partnerships and collaboration so we can do this even more successfully in the future. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was very insightful to see the very practical ways that the World Bank is incorporating natural capital issues into its projects in several African countries. So now for all the listeners, you've heard our speakers, and the floor is now open to take questions. So I'm going to open the Q&A box, and I'll read out the questions for our panelists, and we'll see how we can address them. So the first question is from a gentleman I know very well called Jerry Ahadji. And Jerry's question is directed at Kevin. And it says, Professor Kevin's point of mainstreaming natural capital is extremely important. However, the challenge has always been how to calculate the cost of externalities, especially in extractive projects. For instance, calculating the costs in river pollution, tailings dam failures, etc. So the question is, how do we develop models or systems to calculate these costs transparently to inform cost benefits analysis as a basis for our developmental plans? So Jerry has asked a very elaborate question, and we'll try and do justice to that. And I think this question is directed at Professor Orama, so we look forward to hearing his response. So Kevin, you can start preparing and collecting your thoughts. The second question is from Chris Masikati. And I'm not sure it's really a question, because it says, due to COVID-19, Alice has a good point there. Due to COVID-19, there has been a migration from towns to rural homes. And for food security, they have increased agricultural requirements. I think this is just a statement to agree with what Alice was saying. So let's see if there are any other questions. The next is an anonymous person. And he says, or he or she, they say, there is a big movement now being pushed faster and harder by the COVID crisis on Africa's wildlife or biodiversity economy. We know Africa's wildlife and biodiversity assets are unique and of global significance. How can international development finance help to stimulate this economy and to provide greater opportunities to Africa's local communities and private sector? And then the third question is, what do you think of using post-COVID debt relief for climate and nature program swaps? And this is from Paul Steele in IIED. Okay, so those are the questions that we have so far.
Vanessa, just before we jump into those questions,
yeah.
Sorry, Vanessa, just to say that there's a couple of people who have added some questions into the chat function as well. So we might be able to come to those in a moment from Rob and from Evelyn. But please do use the Q&A function if you can, and then we can collate them all together. But just to let you know, Vanessa, there's a couple in the chat function there as well.
Good. So I can turn to those later. So let's start with the first 3 or 4 that we have, and we'll run through all our panelists. So Kevin, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you for the interesting questions. First is how to develop models to cost externalities. That's what I understood from this, to inform cost-based benefit analysis. Generally, there has been several efforts since 1970s to try and develop extended cost-benefit analysis tools and models, including what I've talked about in terms of value in natural capital. We know of the big project by the World Bank called WAVES. There are several methodologies that has been developed there. I can't talk through all of them at this webinar. In my own work as well, we've developed tools for integrated value mapping, which is trying to bring in other values of natural capital that are beyond the financial or financialization of natural capital. It's a very complex thing because value in natural capital is like value in life, in my view. And it's always very difficult to be able to know what financial value you will place on that. But to do that, there's been a lot of work that has gone on. We also know the economics of biodiversity, led by my friend Pavan Sukdev, dealing on the value of biodiversity, the economic value of biodiversity. But my proviso there is that all the work that we've done in this area always shows that those methodologies come up with a conservative value. It's a very small part of the value of natural capital. In my own work, it actually shows that most of these models estimates only about 8%, 0.8% of the actual economic value measured in terms of behaviors in the market. So it's just to be careful to say finding a model doesn't mean that we actually have the true value of nature. Because one thing I didn't talk about because of time is the intrinsic value of nature, the religious value of nature, the existence value of nature. There are several forms of value that we can never really find any model that puts the accurate value, economic value on that. Now, post-COVID relief, debt relief for nature swaps and climate change and so on. This is an area that I always, from my PhD in Cambridge, I've always been talking about, in the sense that the more we try to reduce the environment to specific issues like climate change and conservation of wildlife, my colleague from WWF is here. I've had lots of discussions on that with them. We start missing a little bit of the mark. because it is not okay to say, let's just focus on climate change, in my view, because development happens in three angles. And the Sustainable Development Goals paradigm shows us clearly, we have the economic angle, we have the social angle, and also we have the biophysical angle, which is people now refer to as natural capital. But then you find that without one or the other one cannot sustain for a long time. So my concern as an environmental economist is that sometimes we try to push towards the green beyond so much that we try to see it as conflicting with the economic and the social. And what I really advocate is a balance where we take into account the environment, we take into account, the natural environment, we take into account economic growth, and we also take into account social equity. Because without all these three, you cannot get sustainability. And so my argument is that keeping the forest in order to maintain natural capital, while people under the forest living there are poor and dying, is sustainable poverty. And that's not sustainable development. So we need to think about how to balance our approaches towards all these things so that we'll be able to get what I would prefer to discuss, which is more of an inclusive development, where we include the social, the biophysical, the social, and also the economic aspects of growth and development so that we can get sustainability for the long term. I'll stop here because of time as well.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that detailed response. So Alice, very quickly, can you respond to the questions, any of the questions which you feel are most relevant to your experience?
Let me unmute. I can probably respond to the question on stimulating international development finance, stimulating the economy, this economy or wildlife and biodiversity economy. So, we already know there's a huge wildlife and biodiversity economy in Africa. And I mentioned that obviously because of COVID-19, we are not seeing international tourists come through. We've also had to close some of the parks due to health worries as well. But how can they stimulate it? I think one of the things to think about is how can we, beyond tourism, build other sustainable financing models for our biodiversity. And it could be, stimulating local tourism in itself, but there's also other, and Kevin just talked about that, nature does have an existential value even beyond tourism. For example, it's a source of health. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but pharmaceuticals really depend on this, on nature. I'm sure maybe even now some of the vaccines we're trying to develop to resolve to treat COVID-19 could easily be coming from this. So there's a huge existential value there. There's a huge cultural value that Kevin also talked about. How do we stimulate this? How do we make this valuable? I think that's important for us to get development finance and to invest in this sector, even just for that, even if it wasn't just for tourism. It provides a lot of job, of course. It's a carbon sink, so there's always international payments for ecosystem services there for carbon. There are some water towers, so payments for watershed services for all the users. It is amazing. There's a lot of value in nature, and we need to stimulate international finance to this. On debt for nature swaps, yes, I think it's worth considering. It's worth looking at how the ones that we have, not just Seychelles, but even the previous ones that we've done in Africa and all over the world have worked. And I think it's not that you sell your nature for that, it's actually how you can leverage that for a debt for a sustainable future. So I think it's worth, I think it's worth considering, and it's worth a discussion. It's worth a future discussion on the next forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that intervention. So again, very quickly, we'll turn to Thomas, and there are two additional questions that Tom can pick up. I'll just read them out, but they're all in the Q&A. The first question is, how do we assess and stop over-reliance on wildlife for food during the pandemic period? And the second question is, how important are effective and sustainable transport networks to support the green growth agenda and support natural and human capital? It's actually two questions. And then it says, how can transport corridors be designed with these aims in mind? So Tom, over to you. You can respond to these two and the previous questions that we collected.
Yeah, thank you. So the question from Evelyn, I think, is a good one about over-reliance on wildlife for food during the period and in the future. So I think there are at least two answers to that, Evelyn. So the first, which we're involved with, is in this pandemic, when there are people who are being pushed back into poverty and becoming food insecure. One of the answers is social protection programs, and that actually links to the point about protecting human capital. So in more and more countries that we've worked in Africa, there are now social protection programs. Some are small, but actually some are quite large and some are mainstream. So one way to try and minimize the over-reliance on wildlife in certain communities for food during this pandemic is to help with alternative mechanisms, including social protection programs, which give people at least something to keep them out of the most desperate situations. So that's the kind of near term. And medium term, I think the reliance on wildlife and food and that connection is all about the human-animal interaction and conflict and climate-smart agriculture. And that's why I mentioned a big part of our agenda is on food security. And we have a whole range of programs involving in that. And it's about food security in a climate and biodiverse sensitive fashion. So that's a brief answer to that question. And Rob's question on the transport, I think, is also a very nice one, because I think he brings out, there's some elements of complementarity, but there are also elements of contention as well. And the answer is yes, it's very important. And we're doing a couple of things. One is in the urban setting, which I did mention, because I think more and more now Africa is becoming urbanized over the next 2 or 3 decades. We have to have transport and land planning, which is more environmentally friendly in the urban settings. And we're investing in green bus rapid transit systems. We're doing one in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, which will be using electric buses, basically using much less polluting technologies. So number one, in the cities, we need better land planning and we need green transport in the cities. And then I think transport corridors more broadly across the individual countries need to be planned out with two things in mind. One is sensitivity to the natural environment. We've done that in South Asia. We've been able to build roads, railways, and other connections to avoid damaging the most cherished and precious part of our natural environment. So that's one approach. And the other approach, of course, is to build the resilient infrastructure so that it doesn't have to kind of continuously being rebuilt and using natural resources to do the thing twice, 3 times, where if you do it once and do it properly, you can get it right first time. So there are a couple of ways in which we're trying to work on those 2 items that our question has put forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas, for that response. So we have 2 more questions which I want to put to the panel. One is actually directed at Alice. And then the final one is something I would like us to close with, because it challenges us to think a bit deeply. And I think it captures the essence of the entire discussion today. So the first question for Alice, it's a bit long, but I'll read the key highlights. What have we learned from large-scale efforts on landscape restoration? And an example is given in Tigray, Ethiopia. So what works and what doesn't work? What is the best model for an African government which is keen to scale up environmental public work programs to create jobs and stimulate economic recovery? And this is from Caroline Peterson. So Alice, can you quickly respond, and then we'll have closing remarks from the entire panel.
Thank you so much, Caroline Peterson, for giving me such a tough question. What works? I think I have four main points on this one, on what I think is extremely important. First is the science. We need the science to determine the right places for restoration. Not everywhere is going to be valuable for restoration. And so we need to make sure that we know the right places that we're going to get the bang for our buck. Secondly, we need to ensure that there are core benefits. We're not just restoring this land for ecosystem services, those are important, but we need to create jobs. We need to create value chains for gender, for women and for youth. So it's extremely important to make sure that all these core benefits are coming through. We're also restoring for food. We're restoring for water. So the core benefits must be clear. The land use planning must be very clear. As you can imagine, a lot of countries have pledged to restore, for example, the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative. A lot of the countries have pledged quite a few hectares that, but they may not even have all that land just available idle. It is probably land that is already under production, in production with different types of production. So how do you ensure what do you put in there? Is it agroforestry where you could put trees on farms? Is it agriculture? You have to think about how you can still restore in that situation. Some of them are even doing urban forests and stuff like that. So it's important to work with these countries to support that land use planning and that implementation support. And I think for me, finance is key. We need to make sure restoration is bankable. It needs to be, we should create restoration enterprises around this restoration work so that it is valuable, so that I don't feel like I need to cut down these trees. It must be bringing that benefit. And clearly we need to monitor. We need to monitor and make sure that we are getting the benefits that we are restoring for. Thanks.
So thank you, Alice, for laying it out in very practical ways. And I hope it responds to the question that was asked. So now in closing, I'm going to read out a question that was submitted by someone who most of us here know very well, John Mon, who is the research manager of GGKP. And of course, we, the AFDB and GGKP have developed a project on mainstreaming natural capital in development finance. So the question from John is drawing on the essence of our projects. And for the panelists to say, can development finance in Africa help leverage private finance to invest back in nature in a big way? So it's something for you to think about. And I'll invite you all to make your closing remarks very quickly and responding to the very pointed question from John. So let's start with Kevin. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the simple answer to John is yes. And that is what that project is meant to be doing. We've been working on this, and as you know, Vanessa, we are making some progress on that. And I would like to, before I lose the mic, announce to the team that, that we will soon be putting out a call for what we call a global community of practice seminar that will be focusing on basically addressing these questions. So I would like to invite all of you, once that is out, to be able to join so that we can have a more discussion on that. And I've already started laying out in my opening remarks areas and aspects where the development institutions like the African Development Bank, World Bank, and the rest of them should be thinking through. Because actually, there is no economy in Africa without nature in many, many ways. So we need to make sure that we actually start rethinking how we look at nature as something for which economic activities have externalities on, but think of nature as an asset base from which we actually develop our economies. So that rethinking is very, very important in terms of the conceptualization. And I want to emphasize that because at the moment we seem to regard natural capital as something out there, nature, that we need to harness through tourism. Let's go see it. But natural capital for me is beyond only the aesthetic value of nature. It's more than that. So the answer again, I'll say is yes, we can. And I want to actually say, yes, we should. Because without it, we will not be able to achieve sustainable development. And this is a full project that is before us. And I'm hoping that 2-3 years down the line, we will have all the answers. At the moment, we just have all the questions on how MDBs and development finance institutions should be able to do it. But in summary, capacity development, is a very key thing, because at the moment we still do not think about natural capital the way we should. We are not factoring it into our national accounts as the way we should. We are not factoring it into our development project finance the way we should. So training and capacity development is a very key area, and that is why we're establishing that Natural Capital Academy that I have talked about. Policy dialogue is very important as well, because we need to get policymakers to still rethinking how they think of natural capital and how they factor it into their development policy making and so on and so forth. And then the private sector cannot function in an economy if you don't have the environment. So that's why I'm talking about the policy, so that we can have a government-enabled private sector interventions and investments in natural capital. And then the next thing I've talked about is using natural capital as guarantees for both public and private sector investment. We'll have to work out how this can be done and how this should be done. That's part of the challenge of that project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this closing remark. So Alice, you're next up.
Yeah, the natural the guarantee, Kevin, is that debt for nature swap that I was talking about. Yeah, I agree. I agree that yes, and my answer was also yes, that we can and should leverage private finance. In fact, I gave you the example of the Seychelles Blue Bond, which I think was subscribed by 3 institutional investors, a guarantee from the World Bank, and a concessional loan from the Global Environment Facility. That is a perfect example where you have blended finance that brings in both private sector, public and private finance. So yes, it is possible, and we should absolutely do more of these, more and more for our natural capital. And thank you very much once again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Alice, for keeping it short and simple. And so finally, Thomas, can you share your closing remarks with us?
Thank you, Vanessa. So again, John, the answer is yes, but it's yes, although it's going to be pretty tough. It's the short answer to leveraging the finance. Let me just be quite transparent with you guys. Remember I talked about the bank, we put together our Africa Climate Business Plan at the Paris conference, so the last 3 or 4 years, and we've exceeded our targets. However, the one that we didn't succeed in, just to be quite transparent, was the leverage target. We were hoping that we'd put our money in and we'd be able to leverage substantial other finance, and we didn't succeed in doing that, which I think shows you, John, and other colleagues, we've got to carry on trying, and I think we can. And I think Alice gave a couple of good examples that we've been involved with ourselves in Seychelles and elsewhere. However, it's more difficult than we thought. So the good news is we can still try, and I think we can achieve, but it's going to be we need to work very hard on it. So my closing message is to thank you for organising the great session. There's lots of people behind this in the World Bank. My key colleague, Kanta Kamari, I'll introduce you to. She's kind of masterminding this next generation climate business plan. So her and her colleagues are very happy to continue the dialogue with you and everyone on this meeting. And I just want to leave you one message that please be assured, hopefully we agree on many things, we may not agree on everything, but I think what we can have a complete common ground on is that in the World Bank and the Africa region, we're 100% committed to cherishing the natural environment, protecting, preserving, and valuing natural capital, and tackling climate change, and making that approach to climate change development centered. We're going to be doing this at least for we have a plan for the next 6 years. We think we'll be doing it for a lot longer than that, but we have a clear game plan being put in place to make sure that our efforts, our resources, our partnerships are right behind us, and we look forward to continuing the collaboration in the strongest possible way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for those remarks. And thank you to all the panelists. We've really benefited from your insights. I think it's clear that there's a consensus that there's a strong business case for MDBs to invest in natural capital. And the challenge is on us to really take this forward in very practical ways. So I'll hand over to Mark to continue.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, and really pleased to hear human capital coming up in the conversation there. Obviously, the Capitals Coalition brought together not just the natural capital space, but the social and human together. And it's only when we look at this as a whole that we'll be able to address these issues. Some great discussion there. You're going to want to find out more, I'm sure. Go to the website. All of the speakers will be able to engage with you further. There's more questions out there, so please go there and take a look. Next week, we've got data coming up, a really big issue. I know Alice has done a lot of work on data in the past, and everyone has. It's always told to me it's the biggest problem we've got out there, and yet there's a lot of data there. So it's not about there's not enough data. It's about making sure it flows to the right people in the right way. So how are we going to address that? That's going to be a really big one. And then we're going to close off the series with something about change. How does this all lead to action? That's what we've got to get to at the end here. As Thomas was just saying, as Kevin was saying, as Vanessa and Alice have both been saying, we've got to get into actual application and change here and not just talk about it. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed it. You can access this webinar and many others on the African Forum website, and we'll speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.